Alright, so we're starting up now with our fourth section on the Coelomate Invertebrates, and we're going to be starting here with the crustaceans now. So now we're in our second group here of the arthropods. We've done the myriapods, and now we're looking at the class Crustacea. So the class Crustacea is the third largest of the classes within the phylum Arthropoda, and third largest might make it seem like it's not going to be that big, but it's actually about 35,000 described species. It's not that there aren't that many species of crustaceans, it's just that there are so many other species of insects and chelicerates, which are our third and fourth groups that we're going to look at in this particular phylum. So as far as groups within the class Crustacea, this includes everybody from the crabs and lobsters to crayfish, shrimp, barnacles, water fleas, which are sometimes called Daphnia. There's a genus name called Daphnia, which is kind of like, sort of like everybody that uses it to talk about water fleas. And pill bugs, which, a lot of people know as roly-polies or potato bugs or sow bugs. Of course, the common name is a bit misleading there because they're not bugs at all, but they're actually terrestrial crustaceans for the most part that people know about. So with the class Crustacea, there are going to be three segments. The term tegmata is used interchangeably with the term segment, and the first two segments are fused together to form a cephalothorax. So cephalo refers to the head, and thorax refers to the second segment of the thorax. So cephalothorax is one big fused front segment in the crustaceans, and really the easiest way to think about this or picture this is to think about a lobster, right? So a lobster has the kind of little eyes and little feelers up front and the claws, of course, and there's a great big plate behind that, which is actually the thoracic segment. So those two parts together, the head and that big thoracic segment, make up the overall cephalothorax. The crustaceans always have two pairs of antennae, which is unique to the arthropods. There are no other groups that have two pairs of antennae. Myriapods have one. Chelicerates don't have any antenna, and insects typically have one pair of antennae. So having four antennae total is a uniquely crustacean thing to have. There are also a lot more in the way of feeding appendages, more so than the other groups as well. Another feature that will distinguish the crustaceans from the insects is the fact that the crustaceans actually have legs on all of their body segments, thoracic and abdominal segments, whereas the insects are only going to have legs on the thoracic segments. Typically, crustaceans are going to have gills. Those gills will be located up near the abdominal legs, and those legs are going to help serve a function of sort of agitating the water around the gills and mixing in fresh oxygenated water so the animal has a constant supply of good oxygen coming in and CO2 going out, of course, is the other side of that. For the really, really tiny crustaceans like Daphnia, the water fleas, and so forth, they actually use diffusion because they're small enough that works for them, but for any of the bigger crustaceans, they're going to have to go with a gill strategy as opposed to the diffusion strategy. Most crustaceans produce what are called nauplii, which are the larval forms of the animal. Nauplius being singular, nauplii being plural. And this is a scenario kind of like we saw with the mollusks, where even though the adult forms might be very, very different from each other, the juvenile stages, or the nauplius stage, can be very, very similar for some otherwise very, very different crustaceans in this case. So again, that common morphological structure that we see at the beginning of the life is really good evidence for the common ancestry of these organisms. So this is a view of the underside, ventral side of a lobster. We get a good sense for the antenna up here, those feeding appendages we talked about, the legs. In this case, lobsters and crabs and crayfish are called decapods. So they actually have 10 legs. So deca is 10 and pod is, of course, feet. So decapods means 10 legs. Swimmerettes are the little legs back here on the abdominal segments. And lobsters and crayfish also have a specialized tail, which has a telson, which is the sort of the stiff central part of the tail. And uropods, which are the lateral kind of paddle-like structures on the outer parts of the tail, which is used to move the animal through the water very, very quickly. If you've ever tried to pick up a crayfish in the water, their go-to strategy to escape predation, or what they perceive as predation, is to flick their tail, and that will cause them to move very, very quickly back in the water. So they actually flick the tail underneath themselves, and that causes them to shoot backwards in the water and hopefully escape predation, or at the very least, get themselves under a rock where they can then defend themselves with their claws, right? So it's much easier to defend yourself if you're under shelter than if you're just sort of exposed there in the water. This picture here is sort of an illustration of one of those nauplius larval forms that we talked about with the crustaceans. For the most part, crustaceans are dioecious or gonochoric, Barnacles have a lot more in the way of reproductive flexibility by species. There are some that are dioecious, there are some that are also monoecious, and there's a whole lot of in-betweens in the barnacles. They're a very, very bizarre group when it comes to reproductive strategies. We see different types of copulation depending on if we're dealing with terrestrial or aquatic crustaceans. And again, we talked about that Nauplius and the common ancestry within the group as well. As far as habitats, I mentioned a second ago, you can find crustaceans. Typically, they're going to be aquatic. They're going to be either marine or freshwater, but there are a few terrestrial crustaceans. Of course, the roly-polies are a fairly familiar one. Actually, this guy in this picture up here, this is a marine isopod, which is related to the roly-polies. They're in the same group, same order. Very, very large, more like the size of a football as opposed to a terrestrial crustacean, which you guys probably have some familiarity with, fairly small. But this guy up here is actually a detritivore. It just feeds on whatever dead stuff happens to come down from above it, and even though it looks really scary and sort of evil in this picture, they're actually completely harmless, and they don't have any negative impacts on people at all. So isopods, like I said, are the sow bugs, roly-polies, pill bugs. When we say isopod, it means same leg. So if you look at this picture here, this guy or girl, all of its legs are same size, same shape, not a whole lot of differentiation there, so they're in the order Isopoda. The order Copepoda is the one that includes the water fleas and Daphne and a few other things, very, very important parts of the plankton part of the aquatic food chain. So if you're not familiar, in the aquatic system, just like on land, everything starts off with the producers, so things that are photosynthetic kind of make up the base of the food chain. And in the aquatic setting, this next group, the copepods, a lot of the times are the second sort of link in the food chain. They're the ones that feed on the producers, and in turn, they provide food for some of the smaller fish. And of course, smaller fishes provide food for bigger fishes and so on. So they're a really important link in the food chain. Those copepods are really important food for the smallest of fishes, which then in turn provide food for the larger fishes and other kinds of animals as well. Decapods, I mentioned before, these are crustaceans that have 10 legs. So for those, and really for a lot of the others as well, not just decapods, they're going to have an exoskeleton made of calcium carbonate. I mentioned that back in our previous section on the crustaceans. They also have those swimmerets, which are the little tiny legs on the abdominal segments, which are used to circulate oxygenated water over the gills. We talked about the uropods and telson, which are both parts of the tail. All right, so those are just a few more bits of information there on the decapods, which is probably for most of us the most familiar of the crustaceans. We then have the order Cirripedia, which Cirripedia literally translates to featherfoot, and the reason for that is their legs are modified into these very oftentimes intricate and delicate, very, very fine structured projections they use to capture food. So featherfoot is referring to the fact their legs are modified to capture food, and they're very delicate, intricate sorts of structures. Barnacles typically start off as a free-swimming organism and then transition into more of an attached, sessile type organism later on in life. Barnacles, a lot of times you'll find them attached to ships or docks or piers or sometimes even sea turtles and whales. Typically not a real good sign if you see a sea turtle covered up in barnacles. It typically means that it's maybe not as active as it should be, and for that reason probably is sick. But if you see a turtle with one or two barnacles, it's probably not such a big deal. But any more than that, and there's a good chance that turtle is suffering from something which is hindering its swimming. Like I said before, the barnacles are one of the few hermaphroditic groups. They are monoecious, and like I said, some of these things are bizarre in their sexual habits. There's a few species that are primarily female, and the males that are out there are basically a very tiny brain, and the rest of the body is essentially just a penis. So I don't know if you guys like that myself, but for barnacles, it's the majority of the species where they undergo that kind of a reproductive strategy. Just a few pictures here to sort out some of the details. Isopods, again, like this roly-poly. Decapods include both shrimp and crayfish. Daphnia is one of those copepods, parts of the marine and freshwater plankton. All of these are different groups of crustaceans. So it does not have a picture of the barnacles on this slide, but we do have the other three orders that we talked about. Now, our third class within the arthropods is the second biggest in terms of number of species. It's the class Chelicerata. And the chelicerates include things like spiders, ticks, mites, scorpions, daddy longlegs, which sometimes surprises people. These are not actually spiders. Daddy longlegs, even though they look superficially like a spider, are a completely different group of chelicerates. They're related, but they're more of a distant cousin to the spiders than anything else. We also have in this group horseshoe crabs and sea spiders, which, again, common names not always that accurate. Sea spiders also are not spiders. So the one distinguishing feature of this group is the presence of what are called chelicerae, which are typically either going to be fangs or pinchers, depending on if we're dealing with a spider or spider-like animal versus more of a scorpion-like animal. These guys have two body segments for the most part. They have a frontmost prosoma, which again, pro means before, soma means body. This is the first segment, and all of the legs are attached to the prosoma. So in the chelicerate world, the prosoma is involved in sensing the environment and also in all of its movement. So the mouth parts, the eyes, chemosensory structures, and legs are all attached to the prosoma, and everything else is performed by the opisthosoma, which is the back segment. So if you guys happen to know off the top of your head, or if you just sort of Google a picture of the Spider-Man logo, that's actually kind of a good way to remember it. It's actually, at least in terms of the two body segments and the leg orientation, fairly accurate. If you look at the Spider-Man logo, you'll notice that all 8 legs on that spider are attached to the front segment, and that's actually, biologically accurate up to a point, I suppose. But the back, larger segment is where you find all of the digestive and reproductive and respiratory and circulatory and all of the other main system function that we find in the body of the chelicerate. Myristomata are the horseshoe crabs. They are what you see in this top picture here. It's a relatively small order of arthropods. They have the shell on the back. They are actually kind of a cool animal in the sense that they're probably some of the first organisms to climb out of the ocean and get onto land. And the reason they did that was to be able to reproduce in safety. So you can imagine back in the day when the ocean was the most heavily colonized of environments, if you're able to get out of the water to lay your eggs, so you're not only safe while you're doing it, but your offspring are also safe, at least for a while before they go back into the water. That was actually a pretty good way to go, and that became, eventually transitioned into the point where some of these animals that came out of the water just stayed on land. But the horseshoe crabs still kind of harken back to that get out of the water to reproduce and then go back into the water and face all your natural enemies kind of a thing that we see. Myristomata or horseshoe crabs also have some really cool properties with their blood, which is being investigated for all kinds of anti-cancer properties and other medical applications. So very, very old group, but one that's still kind of interest today. The arachnids are the other main group of arthropods that we're going to look at. So this is the spiders, ticks, mites, scorpions, and harvestmen. The arachnids are then broken up into two orders, the Acari and the Araneae. So the Acari represent the ticks and mites. So in the ticks and mites, there's about 30,000 described species of these organisms. They're always, for the most part, pretty small. Mites especially tend to be very, very tiny. For the most part, we don't really ever see or think of mites unless we're dealing with some type of maybe a parasitic infestation on one of our pets, like ear mites or something like that. There are some types of mange caused by mites as well. Ticks can be a little bit bigger, and of course we think of those also as being ectoparasites. Nobody really likes to think of ticks, but of course they're a fact of life if you go outside at all. Both of these two groups, ticks and mites, 30,000 species, that's an order. So, we've seen most of the phyla that we've looked at aren't as big as this one order of chelicerates. So it's actually a very, very big group. For the most part, the mites are more diverse than the ticks, because we see a lot of detritivorous mites out there that help to circulate nutrients back into the environment after they've been released by living things that have died. If you've ever seen outside, even on a sidewalk sometimes, those little tiny red dots that are crawling around on the ground, those actually are a type of detritivorous mite that they decompose stuff. They help break down dead plant matter. They're not harmful at all. They don't bite. They seem kind of creepy when you first see them, but they're actually not harmful at all to people. That's one type of mite that you might notice. The other place we see mites being somewhat problematic at times, but also ticks, is in being disease vectors. So we see things like Lyme disease is vectored or carried by one type of tick. We also see there's a condition essentially called tick fever, which is it's caused by a bacterium, which is vectored by ticks as well. So those can be problematic that way. There's a few others too that can do that, but for the most part, ticks are not especially harmful aside from just being kind of creepy and gross. They're not going to cause you a great deal of harm. Now, our other big order of the arachnids would be the Araneae, and the Araneae are the spiders. And so people typically are a little bit more familiar with spiders, usually not in a positive way. Most people are not huge fans of spiders, but There's about 35,000 described species of spiders currently known to science. Um, every single one of them is predatory and carnivorous. They're all venomous as well, even though most spiders can't cause a substantial bite to a human. They can't really deliver venom or cause any great degree of harm. All spiders are venomous and predatory. All spiders can also spin silk webs. Now, the way they do that and why they do that depends on the kind of spider you're looking at. So some spiders spin, a great big Charlotte's Web kind of web where it's this big intricate thing that's designed to catch flies that come by. That's a thing for some kinds of spiders, but that's not the only kind of web there is. There are silk webs that are used for a phenomenon called ballooning, where baby spiders in particular will, when they hatch, they'll let out a little bit of silk. The wind will pick them up and sweep them up into the atmosphere, and that's how they disperse. They can literally disperse hundreds or thousands of miles by this ballooning behavior where they use their silk. There are spiders that will use their silk as a sort of a safety mechanism so that if they fall off of something, the silk catches them and prevents them from actually falling all the way to the ground. There are spiders that will use their silk as a way to find a mate. So females will trail out silk behind them. Males, when they come across that silk, will follow it back to wherever the female is, and then mating will occur. There are what are called trapdoor spiders that use their silk to create their trapdoor trap that they use to capture their prey. And if you get a chance, I highly encourage you to look up a YouTube video of a trapdoor spider in action. It is absolutely terrifying. They're not big, they're not a threat to humans in any way, but they're a very dramatic example of what we call an ambush predator, using that silk in their trapdoors that they use to catch their prey. Speaking of the hunting strategies, some spiders are more of a sit and wait ambush predator. Other spiders are more of an active hunter. So tarantulas, for example, spend a lot of time out there just sort of roaming around looking for prey, versus the trapdoor spider, which is a classical ambush. It just sort of sits there and waits and waits and waits until something happens to come by and then it grabs it. So there's a lot of variety there in hunting strategies as well. In terms of the poison involved, there are a lot of species that are venomous enough to cause harm to a human, but in this part of the world, in Northeast Ohio, there's really only two that can cause much issue at all, and they're both exceedingly rare. It is very, very uncommon for somebody to get bitten by either of these two spiders, especially the black widow. Very, very uncommon to see any sort of harm caused by these things, despite their reputation. And despite the fact that they look sort of wicked, something about the shape of their legs and their overall body that makes them look really, really just sort of treacherous and evil. But black widow spiders are really hard to find. And I've found black widow spiders, but it's after expending a fair amount of effort to find one. I've actually come across a couple of nests as well where females have just had an egg sac hatch. So you've got the female black widow and then a couple hundred babies kind of hanging out there together. That's not such a fun thing to find, but they're relatively docile. I don't recommend it, but if you happen to have one on your skin, the chances of them biting you are actually very, very slim unless they feel threatened. They're actually fairly passive in terms of their behavior. Now, again, don't try it, because if you try it, you're going to be the one exception where one actually does bite for no reason. But in my experience, they tend to be relatively docile. And black widows typically don't live in places where people are going to be all that often. Right? So in other words, black widows are going to be, they're off in the woods somewhere, they're under a wood pile, they're in a rotting log, and that's where they're hunting. They're not in your house, they're not looking for you, they're not trying to bite you, they have absolutely no reason to bite you. So black widows typically don't cause much of an issue. Now, the brown recluse, on the other hand, well, it's not going to try to bite you to hurt you or harm you or anything like that. The incidence of brown recluse bites is quite a bit higher than black widows because brown recluses like to live with people. Something about the human habitation that brown recluses really seem to find attractive. They like to live in, dusty attics or basements or garages or like a shed in somebody's backyard. They like those kinds of places. So it's again, I'm not going to say it's common, but it is not uncommon for somebody to go out to the garden shed and they reach for a tool up on the top shelf and there happens to be a brown recluse there and it nails them on the fingertip, right? If either of the two spiders does bite somebody, it's not like necessarily a deadly bite, but it does cause a lot of tissue damage. It causes tissue necrosis. The tissue around the site of the bite will die, essentially. It'll turn black, and that will spread a pretty good distance from where the bite occurred on the rest of the body. So not a pleasant sight at all if you ever see a bite from one of these two spiders. But again, I cannot emphasize this enough. they are not trying to bite people, right? If anything, it's when we encroach on them that there are problems. It's not them coming looking for us. We're too big for them to eat. And the only reason they have to bite somebody is A, to eat them, which is not going to work for us, or B, because they feel threatened. So unless you threaten one of these two spiders, you have absolutely nothing to worry about. And I'm not going to go into a long spiel about why you shouldn't be afraid of spiders. I get it. It's a creepy crawly thing. There's some really good evidence that our fear of spiders as a species goes back to our evolutionary roots back in the old days. But keep in mind that you are like almost infinitely bigger than any spider out there, and you have absolutely no reason to fear most of them, and they have every reason to fear you. So, it's okay to be afraid of them, but just keep it in perspective, I guess is what I'm saying. All right, from there we're going to go to the hexapods, which are the insects. The term hexapod means 6 legs. So this is actually a good time to cut off section 4, and we're going to start up with our next section here in just a second, and we're going to talk quite a bit about the insects.